It could have been just another Sunday, another quiet Hawaiian day of rest, while the turmoil and pain of a great war in Europe was, in fact, a half a world away. The great ships of the Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, the pride of America's Navy. It could have been just another Sunday, but it wasn't. It was Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and for Americans, their war had just begun. .360 planes of the Japanese fleet strike the island of Oahu, sweeping devastation and chaos amongst the American warships bottled up in the harbor. In desperation, pilots and gunners alike scramble to their planes. Too late to stem the wave upon wave of determined Japanese pilots as planes and men and ships suffered great wounds of battle, and in some cases, like the Arizona, simply disappear in a mighty explosion and slip beneath the water forever, taking her men with her. By sheer good fortune, 3 carriers of the American fleet are at sea that fateful Sunday morning. For the moment, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga are all that stand between the shores of North America and the dedicated aims of the Japanese Empire. That and a handful of submarines are given the awesome task of standing watch across the vast Pacific and holding fast, whilst a hurt and confused nation is to catch its breath and prepare to defend itself. The initial victory over the Americans inspires the Japanese war machine as they sweep across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. To an exact and well-planned timetable, the combined air, sea, and land forces of Imperial Japan set in motion a strategic military conquest of Asia and the Pacific. Victory follows victory. Japanese attack planes quickly establish air superiority throughout their rapidly expanding empire. The pride of the British fleet in Asia, His Majesty's battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse go down in less than an hour of fierce bombing. The great naval base at Singapore suddenly becomes a base without a fleet. Their guns pointing seaward, they are no match for the Japanese, who rush southward through Malaya, swallowing the great port city with hardly a pause. They march across Thailand and Indochina and meet resistance at the Burmese frontier. What was initially to be a rearguard action becomes an uncontrolled rout as panic triggers a bloody retreat of British, Burmese, and Chinese troops. The great oil fields of the Dutch East Indies are swept up as part of the giant prize of war. The combined might of militant Japan is relentless and seemingly invincible. From Manchuria and China's great coastal cities to the tip of Alaska, to New Guinea, to Australia, to the border of India, the net of Japanese conquest spreads, its pattern and seam without flaw, except for the Philippines. Tokyo had allotted General Homa a schedule of 50 days to crush the combined U.S. and Filipino troops and secure the Philippines. The 8th of December, 1941, scant hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 108 bombers with fighter escorts strike Clark Field and obliterate most of the B-17s and fighters sitting idle or hangared. By December 26th, Manila is declared an open city. Douglas MacArthur, overall commander, has ordered all troops to Bataan Peninsula and his own headquarters to the island fortress of Corregidor. Scarcely a month has passed. In their plan to subjugate the peoples of Asia, the Japanese have often found ready supporters amongst the European-dominated colonies. But they had counted wrong on the Philippines. Filipino and American fighting men, their backs to the sea, take a stand across the rugged jungle terrain of Bataan and doggedly withstand hunger, disease, and the amassed might of Japan's finest soldiers. 50 days become as 2 months, which become 4 months, and still the surviving guns of Corregidor offer support to the battered men of Bataan. Those few ragtag remnants of fighting men who pay a bitter price for the most desperately needed commodity in the early months of the war with Japan: time. The thinly spread sea watch across the Pacific. The gallant volunteer pilots of the Flying Tigers, always against superior numbers. The grit of men like Wingate, Slim, and Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who lead their beaten soldiers out of Burma's jungle hell, only to return and carry the fight to the enemy. April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers lurch skyward from the deck of the USS Hornet. In disbelief, the citizens of Tokyo experience the unthinkable. The Americans stage an air raid on Tokyo. America is barely 4 months into its war with Japan. The remaining defenders of Bataan, racked and ravaged by the wounds of battle, hunger, and exhaustion, surrender and are ruthlessly submitted to a suicide death march. Corregidor stubbornly resists. It is approaching the 5th month of their siege. The Japanese timetable for conquest has hit a snag. The Coral Sea. The air arm of the Japanese fleet is stopped for the first time, and an Allied strategic victory puts a halt to Japanese plans for the invasion of Australia. It coincides with the final surrender of Corregidor. Gallant men and women have paid a terrible price to stem the tide of Japanese military ambition. It is June 1942. Admiral Yamamoto orders a mighty armada of 165 warships to set sail for what he is certain will be a reaffirmation of Japanese might. Planning to draw the American Pacific Fleet northward, the bulk of the Japanese task force converges on tiny Midway Island. Confident of the element of surprise and leaving nothing to chance, Yamamoto arrays an awesome strike force that includes 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, an escort of more than 40 cruisers and destroyers, and a convoy of 51,000 soldiers. U.S. naval intelligence has cracked the Japanese Purple Code, and discovering the impending threat, Admiral Nimitz hastily orders the American fleet under Admirals Fletcher and Spruance to engage the onrushing enemy. 50 U.S. ships and submarines assembled north of Midway. The first wave of Japanese bombers strike Midway, inflicting severe damage. The Japanese are startled to discover the presence of the American fleet to their northeast. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown launch dive bombers and torpedo planes to the attack. More than 500 combat aircraft are launched from the decks of the embattled Japanese and American carriers. The entire first wave of American torpedo planes are nearly wiped out in an attempt to halt the superior enemy force. Dive bombers finished the task. In minutes, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Suryu are flaming wrecks. A Japanese counterattack reaches the American fleet. America loses the venerable Yorktown and an escort destroyer. 132 U.S. aircraft are lost, and 7 airmen and sailors. But the price to the enemy is staggering. 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, 275 planes, and 3,500 men. The tide has turned. Henceforth, the Empire will be on the defensive, struggling to hold their prior gains. It will be a long and bitter struggle. British and American forces in Burma continue to mount a campaign of gradual containment, stubbornly forcing the Japanese to slow their expansion and dig in as the monsoon season approaches. Unarmed cargo planes crawl their way upward over the dizzying heights of the Himalayas to haul desperately needed supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's beleaguered Chinese army, while Chennault's flying tigers harass the enemy from the air. Disregarding the tremendous odds against them, their battered planes rise again and again to engage in bitter dogfights Japan's superior air forces. Japan's setbacks on the sea and in the air have not, however, been shared by the hardened troops of the Japanese army. The war on the land will be the deciding factor. U.S. Marines set the pace of things to come. It is August 1942. An American amphibious force moves against the Solomon Islands. Units of the 1st Marine Division establish beachheads on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Determined they must stop the American initiative, the Japanese Navy rushes supplies to their island garrisons. Day and night, continuous battles rage at sea and on land as Marines and Japanese troops struggle for every foot of terrain. It is a contest in which there is no turning back. In the end, it is the Marines that are there to stay.
The march of time! Outward bound in 1943, from a score of U.S. bases, are never-ending lines of convoys. Their destinations any one of a dozen widely scattered ports. In each vessel's hold are piled tons of the weapons and war materials, the food and supplies which are now pouring out from U.S. mills, farms, and factories.
The enormous energy of American industries awakens and is transformed from former peacetime roles. With Herculean effort, they meet the demands of a nation at war, a nation struggling for its very survival. Americans working around the clock without pause gird themselves for the impossible, to meet the needs of American troops fighting 2 separate global wars and simultaneously help to provide weapons and provisions for America's allies.
The Army and Navy together will one day be able to bring into the offensive against the enemy the full industrial and military might of the whole nation and all its people. Time marches on.
It is 1943. Allied command begins the long, arduous task of driving the enemy back from their defensive perimeters in the Southwest Pacific. Fleet operations hammer Japanese-held bases along New Guinea's northern coast. The American 5th Air Force establishes a pattern of support operations that again and again launch continuous waves of fighters and bombers that decimate enemy ground installations. Allied ground forces under MacArthur's command begin the grisly, dirty job of dislodging die-hard Japanese troops dug in along New Guinea's jungle-infested coastline. It is also a war against the savage elements of weather and terrain. Soldiers drag themselves through a sludge of mud and dense vegetation, seeking out an elusive and determined enemy. Allied Nimitz strategy demands the isolation and eventual collapse of Japan's main base at Rabaul. Admiral Yamamoto, quick to recognize Allied intentions, directs units under his command to meet and repulse this threat. By the end of the year, Allied forces gain air and sea superiority. The Japanese have lost more than 3,000 planes and pilots. Their ranks of skilled veteran pilots are rapidly thinning, and with the death of Yamamoto, they have lost their most skilled military strategist. Allied attention is now drawn northward to the island chains of the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. American and Japanese troops will engage in some of the most severe and violent military engagements of the war. The landing and subsequent battle for the tiny atoll of Tarawa will forecast what is to come. Combat veterans under Japanese Admiral Shibasaki dig in and await the amphibious assault of the 2nd Marine Division. In a bitter give and take for a scrap of beachhead, the adversaries battle for supremacy. In a last suicidal counterattack, Japanese forces collapse. The entire Japanese garrison has been wiped out, save for a handful of soldiers. The drain on the capacity of the Japanese industrial war machine is taking its toll, and that reality is being felt across the empire's long line of defense. Deep penetration of Japan's sea lanes by American submarines is closing the artery of supply to the far-flung garrisons of the empire. In 1943 alone, over 300 Japanese supply ships are sunk by American subs. British and Allied forces hold the line at India's frontier. Slowly, the Japanese are pushed back deeper into Burma, harassed relentlessly by British and American air units, who now dominate the skies over Southeast Asia. The campaign for control of Japan's chain of fortified islands continues. Kwajalein, February 1944. Marine and Army units hit the beaches after 3 days of saturated naval and aerial bombardment. By week's end, the island is in American hands, at a cost of 372 casualties. The Japanese count their dead at nearly 8,000 defenders. In Eniwetok, 3 battalions of U.S. troops lose 339 men as the price of victory. The Japanese garrison of 2,200 is annihilated. June 1944. Marine units make 8 beachheads on heavily defended Saipan. It is nearly a month of bitter struggle before the island citadel falls. American losses are 3,126 killed in action. The enemy body count is 27,000. Alarmed by the rapid successes of American amphibious units, Admiral Osawa orders his carrier strike force into the Philippine Sea to search for and attack American naval units. He urges his attack force of 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 light and heavy cruisers, and 28 destroyers to full combat readiness. It is June 1944, and what had been a mere skeleton of American sea power only 2 years before is now an awesome force to reckon with. Carrier Task Force 58, backed by the battle fleet of Admiral Spruance, numbers 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 heavy and light cruisers, and 69 destroyers. U.S. planes outnumber the Japanese, nearly 2 to 1. The encounter is to be the last great one-on-one battle of aircraft carriers, and Japan's last chance to stem the tide of Allied victory in the Pacific. History refers to the engagement as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but the American pilots will always remember it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By nightfall, the Japanese have lost 346 planes and 2 carriers. Osawa hastily withdraws. The following day, another carrier is sunk and an additional loss of 65 planes. The Americans have lost altogether but 30 planes and the loss of not a single surface ship. The dream of empire is doomed. The American timetable is stepped up. A mighty armada of more than 700 ships bearing 200,000 troops is preparing for their massed landings on the beaches of Leyte, the Philippines. Aware that the retaking of the Philippines will isolate Japan and cut off supply lines of oil from the Indies, it is determined that at any cost, the liberation of the Philippines must be stopped. One last great desperate plan, one final engagement destined to become the greatest naval battle in history. 4 separate fleets under Admirals Osawa, Kurita, Shima, and Nishimura are to converge on the central Philippines, to lure from the beachheads U.S. naval support ships and effect a surprise strike at the amphibious forces. For 3 days in October 1944, the island-studded waters of the Philippines become a shooting gallery of naval warfare. The Sibuyan Sea, the Surigao Straits, Samar, Cape Angan. By day and night, a series of furious chase and running firefights ensues, involving 282 ships of war. In the end, the skill of Japanese strategy is to fail them for the lack of effective air power. It is cataclysmic in its final count. Casualties run 4 to 1 in favor of the victorious Americans. The Japanese lose 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 500 aircraft of what remains of the Empire's once mighty air arm. Still ahead is the task of liberating the Philippines from the iron grip of 350,000 hardened Japanese troops under the command of General Yamashita, conqueror of Malaya and Singapore. The glint of victory may be on the horizon, but the Japanese homeland is still a long way off. The war is far from over. A bitter struggle for Leyte results in the gradual withdrawal of Japanese units to Luzon. Stubbornly, Yamashita gives ground. Savage street fighting and house-to-house close combat slowly, painfully, drives enemy forces from Manila. The task of seeking out the remaining isolated Japanese units in the Philippine campaign will continue on for the duration of the war. Iwo Jima, a rock-strewn island complex of caves, tunnels, and concrete defenses overshadowed by Mount Suribachi and garrisoned by 22,000 die-hard Japanese. Air and naval units pound enemy installations as assault teams of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches. The long, bloody struggle up from the thin strip of beachhead becomes a grim slaughter in close hand-to-hand fighting. A suicide kamikaze breaks through the intense hail of anti-aircraft fire and bursts upon the deck of the Saratoga, destroying 42 planes and killing 123 men. Only 212 of the Japanese garrison survive, preferring death and the strict, unyielding code of Bushido. The Marines take the summit of Suribachi, and American air power has gained an advanced base from which it can now carry the war to the Japanese homeland. April 1945. A great fleet of Allied ships prepares for the assault on Okinawa. Along an 8-mile stretch of beach, long columns of landing craft stream towards the shore as 1,300 vessels disgorge the first massive wave of troops. 60,000 men take and hold the beachhead. In desperation, the Japanese hurl wave after wave of suicidal kamikazes against the Armada. With fanatical dedication, some of the attackers run the gauntlet of intense anti-aircraft fire. The Yorktown and the Wasp are badly damaged, as is the carrier Franklin, which is towed from the scene, her crews valiantly struggling to quench the flames and save their ship. In all, the Japanese are to launch more than 3,000 sorties of suicide planes and pilots. The results are severe. 21 U.S. ships sunk, another 43 permanently put out of action. The Japanese have elaborated an interlocking network of mountain defenses cut across the southern extreme of the island. It is here at the Mashinato Line that American forces will face stiff and fanatical opposition. In less than 3 months of savage combat, the toll of Japanese dead will exceed 120,000. Many sealed in caves, refusing surrender. Many more as suicides, who will simply leap to their deaths from high cliffs. Allied forces draw Japan's net of empire ever closer. Super Fortress B-29s flying at high altitudes and capable of long distances are bringing the war to the Japanese homeland. Conquest of the Marianas and Iwo Jima makes possible continuous airstrikes from new air bases seized by advancing Allied ground forces. Japanese fighter wings take their toll of American bombers until long-range P-51 fighter escorts are able to accompany the superforce and stave off enemy attacks. Tokyo is set ablaze as 334 B-29s sweep in at 7,000 feet, raining 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. 15 square miles of the city are destroyed. 83,000 dead, 100,000 wounded. The operations continue over Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, and Yokohama. The morale of the Japanese people sinks to its lowest ebb. Millions are homeless. Food is scarce. Japan is ultimately under siege. And though all appears hopeless for survival of Japan as a military adversary, there are still some 4 million Japanese troops in China, Manchuria, and in Japan. And they may well prefer a self-imposed genocide to surrender. The Allies prepare for the difficult task of a war prolonged by an implacable and unyielding foe. The decision, finally, will rest with Harry S. Truman, President of the United States. On his conscience will rest the responsibility of launching a doomsday weapon of such significance that a single device can obliterate an entire city in the pause of a single breath. Are the lives of 100,000 civilians a justifiable sacrifice for the sake of saving perhaps other millions? It will become the rhetoric of history. The 6th of August, 1945. The Enola Gay at high altitude will drop from its open bay an atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima. In a flash and rush of burning wind, 78,000 people will die. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffers a similar fate. From that moment forward, the structure of war and world politics will have changed forever. The Emperor Hirohito accepts unconditional surrender. The victorious Allies begin their occupation of Japan. September 2nd, in solemn ceremonies aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri, and while anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government meet with a special delegation of the Allied powers. It is General MacArthur who will impart to all present the significance of this gathering.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
A simple stroke of the pens, and the war with Japan is over. The Second and perhaps last World War has ended.